The 1994 movie The Crow starring the late Brandon Lee has been a favourite of mine since I was a kid. It's not just about the action or storyline for me, it's also the atmosphere and style that really stood out. Even back then I could appreciate how unique it felt. It's definitely a product of its time and some moments haven't aged all that well, but honestly that doesn't bother me. I hadn't watched it since around 2001 until recently, and considering all the dark adult themes packed into it, I'm kinda surprised I was even allowed to watch it at that age, but that's probably why it left such a strong impression. The Crow started as a comic created by James O'Barr in 1989. The story was deeply personal for him as he created it as a way to cope with the grief of losing his fiancée to a drunk driving accident, which also reflected in the main character Eric Draven, who seeks revenge for the death of his love interest. The comic became a cult hit and naturally Hollywood took notice. What makes the movie so special is how it managed to capture the spirit of the comic while adding its own unique style. The film retained that gritty, gothic atmosphere that made the comic stand out. The soundtrack also added so much more to the aesthetic, featuring artists like The Cure, Nine Inch Nails and Rage Against the Machine, which helped define the film's cultural impact. Unfortunately, the film's legacy is tied to tragedy as well, with Brandon Lee's accidental death while filming. But it also makes this movie that much more memorable and special because of all these different elements tied to it. Several sequels were made after the success of the first one, but none of these films managed to capture that same magic. They all tried to maintain that dark gothic style, but the performances, stories and overall execution just didn't hit the mark with audiences or critics the way the original did. So obviously the franchise faded into the background. Which brings us to 2024, with yet another reimagined version finally coming out after more than a decade of various directors, actors and legal battles which caused numerous delays. This movie was actually supposed to have either Bradley Cooper, Tom Hiddleston or Luke Evans playing the lead role, but they ended up going with Bill Skarsgård instead, which wasn't a bad choice. But the movie itself wasn't that great. I kinda knew that going into it based on one of the trailers I saw, but I thought I'd give it a chance anyway, and nah, it didn't hit for me. I know it's trying to be its own thing, and I do give it points for that, but I don't think it executed it well enough for me personally. Obviously the first film captures the look of the comics more, which still leaves an impact to this day. Rewatching it made me appreciate the work that went into executing it. It's clear that the new one is trying to distance itself from that whole aesthetic, and while it does look good visually, especially with its own unique style, that's almost all it has in my opinion. The writing felt a little bit Tumblr-ish at certain moments between Eric and Shelley, and it was a bit hard to sit through. Both actors did have decent chemistry during some of those scenes, but any moment of real authentic sound and dialogue was few and far between, and I could have done with a lot more of that to give the characters and the movie a bit more depth. There were moments that didn't make sense to me, and maybe I missed something, but I have to talk about it. Basically, the villain, who I'll talk more about, has this power he got from the devil where he can whisper into people's ears and get them to do dark things. He does this to Shelley and she ends up killing someone, which she's obviously ashamed of. One of her friends had been filming the entire time, which the main villain isn't happy about after finding out. So he sends his henchmen after them, and that's the main reason for her death and the death of her friends as well. Plus Eric, hence the reason why he's in limbo and gets the power of the Crow. Long story short, Eric eventually finds out what happened since Shelley had kept it vague, but he ends up finding her phone with the footage after snooping around. Before he saw the footage, he knew about the whole whispering thing because one of Shelley's close friends which he tracks down was there when it happened, and he explained the entire situation to him. Yet Eric still doubts that she didn't do it on purpose. Then he gets dragged back down to limbo, loses his powers because of it, and makes a deal to trade his soul for hers so she can come back to life, and I was like, what is going on? That whole scenario just felt out of place and forced, plus it didn't make sense. The villain could have been more interesting, even more so than the one in the first movie. The lead up to the conflict between him and Eric was one of the parts of the movie that I did enjoy quite a bit. The fight scenes weren't overly cut either, which I always appreciate, and it did look pretty good, I can't lie. But the conflict between him and Eric felt rushed and empty. It seemed like the movie was building up to something crazy and then it just kinda ends, and that's really it to be honest. They spent way too much time on scenes that weren't necessary to the plot, and this is where I felt like the first movie handled the pacing better. It just got straight into what the audience needed to see. So overall, in my opinion, just watch the first movie or read a comic. It's a lot more engaging. Let me know what you thought about the first film or the new one if you've seen it. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this in the future, and thanks so much if you've made it this far into it. Anyway, that's all I've got for now, so I'll catch you in a bit.